like to welcome all of you. It is wonderful to see so many people in attendance. My name is Sarah Duke, and I am the curator of Popular and Applied Graphic Art in the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. Today's Cartoonist Rights panel is hosted by the Prints and Photographs Division, which has been acquiring editorial cartoons for more than 100 years. We also sponsor annual research fellowships and programs through the Swan Foundation. Since 1921, we have carefully collected American political cartoons as well as selected representing opinions from around the world. We estimate that we have some 130,000 cartoon prints and drawings from the early 1600s through today. Only some of the artists, however, have had to be as courageous as this year's winner of the Robert Russell Courage in Cartooning Award. Abel Bellido Cordoba, better known in his native Bolivia as Abacor, is here with us today. We are grateful to have him join us, and you will learn more about him soon. I want to thank my colleague, the journalist Maria Peña, for translating the presentations for him. I now introduce the moderator of today's panel, Rosalind Mazur. Rosalind represented the American Association of Editorial Cartoonists as Friends of the Court in the 1987-1988 U.S. Supreme Court case, Hustler v. Falwell. The unanimous decision was that parody, which no reasonable person expected to be true, was protected free speech. This decision continues to protect the rights of editorial cartoonists to express their opinions in this country. Rosalind champions cartoonists and their art, curating and moderating programs for Cartoonist Rights, AAEC, and other free expression organizations. I now turn over the program to her.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Sarah. Earlier this month, on May 3rd, we marked World Press Freedom Day, a day the United Nations annually acknowledges to highlight the link between press freedom, freedom of expression, and other fundamental human rights. In the 3 decades since World Press Freedom Day was first celebrated, the UN and free expression allies document threats to press freedom and the safety of journalists, chronicling the worrying rise in old and newer forms of repression. As you will hear today, the world of cartoon art has experienced the very same forms of repression as other journalists. When you think about it, repression of all forms of satire, dating back to Greek and Roman times, is quite understandable. Cartoons really get under the skin of political leaders. Whether they are grotesque caricatures, comic exaggerations, or pointed exposure of hypocrisy or corruption, cartoon art is a unique form of free expression that remains vulnerable to the autocrat's cudgel. We have a program for you today that brings together leading cartoonists and free expression champions. I will first introduce our keynote speaker. Following his remarks, I'll introduce our panel. Our keynote speaker is Terry Anderson. Terry has over 25 years' experience as a cartoonist and caricaturist. Born in Paisley, he began his career producing illustrations for the Glasgow Herald while still a schoolboy. He is a founding member of the Scottish Cartoon Art Studio, which marked its 20th anniversary in 2019. Terry is a former president of the Scottish Artists Union, the trade union for all visual artists in Scotland. He's led workshops for children and adults at libraries, festivals, and drawn live in various settings across Britain, Europe, and Asia. As one example of Terry's brilliant work, you can see the slide that's up on the screen now, a cartoon he drew in 2019 protesting the imprisonment of Musa Kart, a Turkish cartoonist who was arrested without charge in 2016. And eventually indicted and incarcerated after 15 years of persecution by the Erdogan regime. For the last several years, Terry has held the executive director role at Cartoonist Rights Network International, Cartoonist Rights, the human rights organization specifically for cartoonists whose work leads to threats to their life or liberty. In 2022, Terry received the Prix Gérard Vandenbroek at the Salon International de la Caricature, du Dessin, de Presse et de Humeur, Europe's largest festival of editorial cartooning. The award is given to cartoonists who have made a significant contribution in the defense of others' rights. He is the first non-francophone to receive it. Terry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosalind. On February 24th last year, the official Twitter account of the Ukrainian government posted this uncredited image, and beneath they said, "This is not a meme, but our and your reality right now." The first part is true. The image is not a meme, it is a political cartoon. It employs caricature, allusion to history, and barbed satirical comment to make a point about events in a way that is more succinct and impactful than the bald written statement, "Vladimir Putin is acting like a Nazi." But the second part of their message is inaccurate. The image is hardly realistic, but it felt like reality to someone in charge of the account, someone who knew that this image would strike a chord, and the 425,000 people who shared it and the 1.8 million who liked it evidently felt strongly one way or the other. Shortly thereafter, schoolgirl Masha Moskalev handed this drawing to teachers at her school in Yefremov, south of Moscow. It led to state security questioning school staff, as well as the girl's father, Alexei, a police search of their home and seizure of belongings, Masha's placement in an orphanage, and criminal charges of discrediting the army that caused Moskalev Sr. to flee. He was later extradited from Minsk and imprisoned. The drawing is indisputably a cartoon. It combines words and pictorial elements and employs a graphic juxtaposition to make a political point. Whether drawn by a professional or an aspirant, in print or online, cartoons get attention. Consequently, cartoonists get in trouble. Cartoonist Rights Network International, just Cartoonist Rights for short, is a small NGO incorporated in Virginia and founded in 1999 by Dr. Robert Russell, known to all as Bro, who worked for many years heading institutional development and humanitarian assistance projects in Sri Lanka, Sudan, Uganda, and Afghanistan. In the field, he came to understand the special contribution cartoonists can make to public discourse and the problems they often face. When his travels ended, he set up a non-profit to assist and defend them. He retired in the autumn of 2019, and I have overseen matters since. Our mission is to strengthen the interconnectedness of cartoonists around the world, campaign to protect their human rights and defend those abused, threatened, and increasingly criminalized or displaced because of their work. Cartoon suggests humour, but I'm afraid this presentation won't be particularly light-hearted. As a matter of course, I am privileged to correspond with some of the best cartoonists in the world, but also those in the direst of circumstances. This presentation will touch upon some troubling subjects, especially misogyny. I believe that a balanced conversation about censored material requires that it be examined dispassionately, but I am acutely aware that some people have paid for that belief with their lives. I offer a warning at the outset that some material may cause distress. Moreover, I do not mean to suggest that cartoonists are uniquely put upon nor singularly emblematic of the fight for freedom of expression. Around the world, journalists, especially foreign correspondents and investigative reporters, elect to place themselves bodily in harm's way every day. And in terms of art, muralists and street artists, those who record hip-hop or folk music, write poetry or perform plays, often find themselves detained and persecuted for speaking truth to power too. All art is political, but editorial cartoons are frequently about the very minutiae and personalities of politics, and that makes cartoonists acutely exposed to the machinations of authoritarians and populists who rarely appreciate the literally reductive nature of a cartoon. Incidentally, you may have noticed that I'm not American, and I do not pretend to be a First Amendment expert. Hence, I prefer freedom of expression as a formulation above freedom of speech or the free press, in part because I think expression is a more accurate description of artistic activity, in part because cartoons are now as often seen outside as well as within the traditional press, and lastly because free speech as a concept has been politicised to the point where there is very little or no common understanding of what that entails. Freedom of expression is fundamental, but it exists alongside and in tension with several other human rights of equal importance. Hence, incitement to violence is a perennial example of expression not protected, as well as laws pertaining to confidentiality, privacy, anonymity, and so on, poorly conceived or wildly abused as some of those laws might be. Absolute free expression, wholly unfettered and devoid of consequence, is impossible and would eventually contravene other manifold rights quite self-evidently. Nevertheless, Cartoonist Rights opposes censorship, but it is an amorphous beast and difficult at times to quantify. And so I wish to walk you through some examples among the great many from the last few years, serving as an illustration of what forms the threat to free expression can take, and we'll look at instances where free expression may have been chilled, all the way up to cartoonists jailed and worse. It's an overture to stimulate conversation in what I can assure you will be the more interesting portion of our time when we hear from our guests. In its most straightforward and familiar mode, a cartoon expresses a negative emotion, from weary dissatisfaction to outrage, in the hope that you, the reader, feel the same way and as such enjoy an emotional release. Perhaps nothing more than a resigned tut of recognition, all the way up to a belly laugh at the expense of the subject. If a cartoonist happens to live in a country run by an authoritarian, such as Equatorial Guinea's President Teodoro Obiang Nguema, they can be victimised at short notice and for any reason. Graphic novelist Ramon Nsé Esono Ebele was arrested and did jail time on wholly bogus charges of counterfeiting. The response was a widespread campaign of support that started here in DC with the EG Justice NGO, was supported by Cartoonist Rights and several other free expression organisations, and concluded with a successful defence from the world-famous Doty Street Chambers law firm. Ramon's work was long-form, but generally speaking, cartoons are not comparable to essays. They are blunt and emphatic, and of course, many cartoonists revel in that, using vulgarity, hyperbole, or gross exaggeration to lampoon the powers that be. But cartoons can also be deceptive. They're simplistic lines deployed to make substantive arguments. Rashita Taneja, aka Sanitary Panels, posts cartoons and short comics to her social media accounts, usually concerned with patriarchy and nationalism in her home country of India. In 2020, a law student wrote to the Supreme Court about 3 cartoons, saying that their portrayal of the court were grounds for contempt proceedings. Absurdly, the Supreme Court has upheld the complaint and is pursuing the cartoonist. If found guilty, she could be sentenced to 6 months jail time. She has been notified of further legal proceedings over cartoons concerning the banning of the hijab from girls' education by Hindu nationalists and may face as much as 3 years in prison. If a cartoonist is not at liberty to criticise their own government, their own head of state, the military, the court, or the police, that is an excellent indicator of a democracy failing its citizens. Bad Yu Tiao is a Chinese dissident living in Australia. A past winner of our Courage in Cartooning award, he is among a growing group of what I call activist cartoonists. Other examples might be Khalid Albai of Sudan, Giancarlo Costantini in Italy, or Fahmi Reza in Malaysia. Until very recently, Badi had no regular working relationship with any media outlet, instead exhibiting his work in public and making them available online for royalty-free use by those who object to the CCP's record on human rights. His series of images on the Beijing Winter Olympics were widely distributed after debuting at the Oslo Freedom Forum in October 2021. In February of 2022, an anonymous group placed posters of the images on the campus of George Washington University. Following a complaint from a Chinese Students' Association, the university president, Mark Wrighton, said, "I am personally offended by the posters. We are working to have them removed as quickly as possible. We will undertake an effort to determine who is responsible," unquote. Within 24 hours, he had retracted, admitting that he did not look at the posters nor research who the artist was, and declared that he supported freedom of speech. A knee-jerk reaction to baseless accusations of xenophobic racism and hastily withdrawn, but the damage was done. Chinese state-affiliated media were soon on campus, interviewing students and seeking the poster's point of origin, a well-worn tactic of intimidation that affects both Chinese studying overseas and their families at home. And with the controversy over the Olympic images came a commensurate spike in threats of violence against Badi Chow, including one serious death threat, evidently from within Australia. Students aren't alone. Educators often feel the threat too. In 2020, a cartoon by David Fitzsimmons of the Arizona Star, responding to the murder of George Floyd, was used in a Texas classroom as part of a lesson about the Black Lives Matter movement. Teachers in American schools frequently use published editorial cartoons to unpack an issue. Students are asked to contextualize and explain the cartoonist's point. Importantly, the views expressed need not reflect anyone else's, nor indeed need to be endorsed. The cartoons are a means to an end, engaging critical thought. Nevertheless, complaints were made by parents, then local police, escalating to State Governor Greg Abbott's call for disciplinary action against the school and the dismissal of the teacher. This is an example of what I call cartoon illiteracy. The objections of the aggrieved centred on a perceived slight against law enforcement and the inferred equivalency to the Ku Klux Klan. But they are not the subject of the cartoon. The identity of the oppressor changes over time, but the prone figure stays the same. The cartoon is about, therefore, the black experience in America in the context of a widespread protest movement centred upon black lives. And on the matter of prejudice, with reference to the Anglosphere, at least, if not elsewhere, the field of political cartooning is very clearly, and unfortunately, insufficiently diverse, and that unquestionably leads to blind spots. So it behooves us to at least listen with grace when someone calls out racism, sexism, or other forms of ingrained prejudice. The key, of course, is to have the good judgment to identify the sincere from the disingenuous, and not jump at the first lob of a weaponised accusation, as occurred in this city last year and concerning Badi Chow's work. Rigorous debate and self-examination are healthy and required, but we must aspire to generate light rather than heat. I'll pause for a moment because it's a dense slide, but I wanted to quote my friend Cinders in full, so I'll give you an opportunity to catch up. Naturally, a cartoonist can be held to conflicting benchmarks when their cartoons cross borders, and that's easier than ever online. Different nations and cultures have greatly varied attitudes on matters like the depiction of scatology and viscera, nudity, and of course religious figures and iconography. And sometimes cartoonists overestimate a section of their immediate audience's familiarity with a particular concept. In the run-up to the Republican primaries of 2016, the Ted Cruz campaign issued a video featuring the senator reading a story to his two daughters, who responded with scripted talking points. Many commentators thought this broke an unwritten but time-honoured rule about the use of children in electioneering, and Ann Telnis of the Washington Post submitted a cartoon depicting Cruz as an organ grinder with a pair of monkeys dancing to his tune. This rendered her liable to the same criticism, i.e. leave the kids out of it, but also, since the Cruz girls have a Cuban grandfather, supporters decried the cartoon as racist. Complaints were made and the cartoon withdrawn from the WashPo website. I think this was a mistake. Ape imagery does have a horrid history of racism in media of all kinds, but this cartoon is not part of that paradigm, and in my view it was being deliberately misread. Less ambiguous was the wave of misogynistic abuse that the cartoonist received in addition to the accusations of racism. Telnis is on the record as saying her experience pales in comparison to those of women under more oppressive regimes. However, I've been on a panel like this with her, and at that time she made it very apparent that the additional burden women carry, especially those with a public profile and on social media, is exhausting and destructive. Despite the potential pitfalls of portraying people in a visual metaphor, cartoonists still employ anthropomorphism, caricature, grotesque and transformative imagery in a figurative and elusive sense. Such a cartoon was this one by Iranian visual artist Atana Farghadani. After passing legislation curtailing the reproductive rights of women, Atena drew parliamentarians as apes and oxen. In context, one would view the former as a symbol of compulsive mimicry, and therefore the easily led, and the latter of stupidity, bullheadedness, if you will. Atena spent almost 2 years in prison for this cartoon, portions of that in solitary confinement, and several weeks on hunger strike. Furthermore, she was subjected to a virginity and pregnancy checks, something that is classed as torture by international standards, simply for shaking hands with a male defence lawyer. Atena was jailed on the assertion that her work undermined the state. Such claims always carry added weight during a crisis, and there has been none in living memory to match the COVID-19 pandemic. In its earliest months, Cartoonist Rights and other organisations warned of the pretext it would provide to authoritarians as public health protections necessarily led to measures against disinformation. Through March and April of 2020, Ahmed Kabir Kishore posted dozens of cartoons to Facebook expressing scepticism on Bangladesh's readiness to face the challenge of the pandemic. In May of that year, he was arrested under the Digital Security Act, a notorious instrument that effectively allows the police to seize anyone who has any kind of online footprint. He was interrogated and, he alleges, tortured. He was held for over 10 months, during which time the injuries sustained in police custody were not treated properly, and nor was his diabetes. He is maimed for life with permanent loss of hearing in one ear and mobility issues. He was granted bail only after a former cellmate and co-accused in the same case died in prison. This was censorship in its purest form. Within a culture of oppression and inhibition, the levers of state were used to pressurise and abuse a dissenting voice in an effort to discredit and destroy them. Kishore's human rights were utterly trammelled, and for it he received our Courage Award in absentia while still a prisoner in 2020. A Herculean effort by human rights defenders at home got him out of the country in 2021, and he's making a new life now in Sweden. We'll end our little global tour there on a note of victory. As the foregoing examples may have already indicated, at the present time, the chief anxiety for the cartoonists we work with is the possibility of criminalisation. It is no longer the threat of extremists. So, with all that said, what does our organisation do to help? Firstly, direct intervention to save threatened cartoonists. For example, in 2022, we provided funds to 8 different cartoonists displaced from homes in Afghanistan, Hong Kong, Iran, Russia, and Ukraine, all with experiences of direct threats to their lives or made refugees by the repression of their governments, and each in need of help with expenses in transit or in their new locations. Vulnerable people who, for obvious reasons, we cannot identify publicly. The second strand is advocacy. Where we cannot give direct support, and where speaking about a case does not compromise safety, we will do what we can to raise the cartoonist profile in the hope that the light I mentioned earlier, preferable to heat, will hasten a positive outcome. The chief instrument for this is the Robert Russell Courage in Cartooning Award, given biannually and alternating with the Kofi Annan Courage in Cartooning Award, presented by the Freedom Cartoonists Foundation. And lastly, we seek to usefully assist all cartoonists everywhere. It's for this reason that we have in the past helped facilitate events such as the Press and Cartooning Global Forum in Paris, and mount initiatives like our legal advisory network for cartoonists who have never before had cause to engage a lawyer and suddenly find that they need help. In terms of what you can do, I would say that cartoonists continue to make valuable and valid contributions. They would scarcely get in the kind of scrapes I have described if their work was worthless. But for the very reasons laid out, many news editors find them to be more trouble than they are worth, and consequently are dropping them entirely. So if whatever or wherever you consume your news, in print or online, whatever service that may be, has no cartoons, ask them why not. That goes double after the sad news yesterday that after a decade showcasing excellent new political cartooning and comics about social issues, and despite a 2023 Eisner Award nomination, the nib is to cease publication this summer, a substantial loss to American cartooning. If these stories have galvanised your interest, then please find us online as we relaunch our website this summer for more about cartoonists fighting for their free expression. We don't have an international cartoonist on today's panel, but as trailed at the top, we do have a contribution from overseas. So if you'd be so kind, please watch this short film.
Vivo en el corazón de Latinoamérica, en Bolivia. Mi nombre es Abel Bellido Córdoba, más conocido como Abecor. Mi país es mágico, lleno de cultura y tradición. Desde muy chico, tuve todos los materiales a disposición para hacer arte. Mi papá era profesor de artes plásticas y arquitecto, y siempre yo andaba imitándolo. Él me apoyó a crecer en las artes. Y luego entré a la carrera de artes plásticas y emprendí mi camino. Por necesidad entré a trabajar un medio de comunicación y luego con el tiempo me volví caricaturista, y ahora las caricaturas son parte de mí. Y con ellas expreso lo que mi entorno me transmite. He recibido críticas buenas y malas, y nunca pensé que esto llegaría a extremos. En cuestión de amenazas, si antes podía salir tranquilo a la calle, ahora salgo con mucha reserva. Este gobierno crea a los guerreros digitales, que su objetivo principal es de crear cuentas falsas en las redes sociales, para atacar, insultar, denigrar, amenazar a cualquiera que tenga diferencia de pensamiento en contra de la política gubernamental. Y lo más insólito es que ellos perciben sueldo de nuestros impuestos. Tengo el apoyo de Página 7, el medio en que trabajo, también de la Asociación de Periodistas de Bolivia, e instituciones nacionales e internacionales, y gente que se solidariza constantemente. Yo quiero seguir tajando el lápiz, quiero seguir dibujando estas cosas que pasan, porque creo que lo más importante ante todo es la libertad de expresión.
Please stand and take some applause.
And now for the introduction of our panel. Kevin Callagher, Cal, is the editorial cartoonist for The Economist magazine of London, The Baltimore Sun, and the online newsletter Counterpoint. He's published over 10,000 cartoons and painted more than 150 magazine covers for The Economist and other publications. Cal is a two-time winner of the Berryman Award from the National Press Foundation, winner of the 2015 Herbluck Prize. He was a prize finalist for the 2015 and 2020 Pulitzer Prize in editorial cartooning, and won the 2014 Grand Prix for Cartoon of the Year in Europe, presented by Press Cartoon Europe. He's given TED Talks, spoken to dozens of high schools and college gatherings here and abroad, often entertaining with live drawings. He is a genuine goodwill ambassador for the world of satire and cartooning. Next to Cal is Alexandra Bowman. Alex Bowman is a freelance illustrator, political cartoonist, satirist, and fine artist from Washington, D.C. She's a contributing writer for the Washington City Paper and D.C. Theater Arts. She is a newly minted Master of the Arts in English, graduating just last week from Georgetown University. Alex was the political cartoonist for the John Kerry and John Kasich-founded environmental organization World War Zero, as well as the Lincoln Project. We had originally planned to have an outstanding press freedom advocate, Karen Kaiser, General Counsel of the Associated Press, join us today. Unfortunately, due to an unexpected conflict, Karen was unable to join us, but we're very pleased to have in her stead Gabe Rotman. Gabe is an attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, where he directs the Technology and Press Freedom Project, which integrates legal, policy advocacy, and public education to protect news gathering and the First Amendment rights of journalists. He also directs the First Amendment Clinic at the University of Virginia School of Law. Gabe has worked in the civil liberties community for more than 2 decades, having served in various roles at the American Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Democracy and Technology, and PEN America. After our presentations, we're going to leave time for questions among us and then questions from the audience. So Cal, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Oh, got the clicker. Thank you, guys, and thank you all for coming. And it's such an honor for me to be here with this very worthy group covering these very important subjects. And I've been entrusted to address the interesting notion of what makes cartoons powerful, taking on my 45 years in the business and working from personal experience. And my first experience dealing with how powerful cartoons can be was back when I was about 12 years old. It was a music class, St. Thomas the Apostles School in Norwalk, Connecticut. And we had a nun. I'm just going to see if I can get her here. Oh, you got that. There she is. A nun who used to, during class and when she was singing, she used to sing with her eyes closed. And so I thought that would be very funny to just capture her picture with her mouth the size of a battleship and her squinty little eyes and the habit behind and so on. And I thought this was great until the girl sitting next to me grabbed the cartoon, had a giggle, started passing it around the room, and soon I became a star to my group of my colleagues, my peers, until the nun got a hold of the cartoon. And she did something that you wouldn't expect would happen today, that she took me by the ear, took me down to the boys' room and made me take a bite out of a bar of soap. And she said, "Don't you ever do that again," and I've been doing them ever since, right? And of course, the thing is that she was a magnificent teacher for me about what cartooning is and the power and potential it has. And I've reflected back on that moment and to figure out what was it about that cartoon that gave this volcanic eruption from my teacher. And I've kind of seen both in this case, but also over my career all around the world, the same sort of things coming up over and over again, and trying to capture for you guys what the major pieces are for a powerful cartoon. I've narrowed it down to four important pieces. The first is that a cartoon is a picture. Now, of course, everyone knows their pictures, and we've heard the adage, a picture says 1,000 words, but there's actually academics who have kind of seen to why pictures actually matter in a big way. So recently, I think it was 2020, Michigan State University was researching about how pictures go into the brain, and they understood that the visual cortex, which is that connection between the eye and the brain, is much more robust than we ever thought before. And that the visual process stimulation works in a lightning fashion and ignites emotions immediately. And in comparison to words, which seem to be much less efficient, there was a study that said that the average person will remember 10% of a story 3 days after it's been told. But that same story told with a picture, the person will regain 65% of the information. So the idea is that words we're constantly pounded with words, but the visual side of things are really important. And I think I actually saw it here earlier during the introduction. I saw there was 2 people in this room who were doom scrolling on their phones. The powerful visual side of it, and that clearly they're being moved emotionally. And I know that for a fact because I was one of them. But the idea is that visuals, we all can easily understand that having something visual is an important part of the power of the cartoon. But the second part is, we've talked about this before, is that cartoons can use humor. Now, we all like to laugh, pretty obvious, but there's also some physical reactions that happen when you're laughing. It releases endorphins that really get your inside juices going, like drugs inside. You want to get it more and more, and so people love comedy shows. And also, it turns out that physically we all act together as a social bond. So when everyone's laughing together, it's a really important part of society. Now, we've seen in this room, as you guys, this hysterical talk that I'm giving here is giving great emotional bonds for everybody in the room. But it also improves your mental health. And it elevates mood, it releases emotional tension, all of these good things. And so you can imagine that it's really obvious that if humor is mixed with pictures, those 2 powerful things together, suddenly you now have something that has mass appeal, and this popularity could also be something that is dangerous in the hands of, in the eyes of a autocrat, in the hands of a 6-year-old cartoonist like myself. I also said cartoons can use humor. And Terry mentioned that not all cartoons are funny, but what happens is the potential that humor is there means that people will give a cartoon a chance. So as a result, when they appear in front of people, say, oh, this could give me some endorphins jumping, I could get some laughter out of this, I'm going to give it a shot. It only wastes 2 seconds, 3 seconds of my busy day, I'm going to have a go. And written words, much more of an investment. People aren't going to go there. So that combination of pictures and words, I think, is a powerful start for a good cartoon. But the bit that I think, the next 2 bits are the important bits that separate a cartoon from other forms of media. And the third bit is satire. It's a type of humor, right? And it's described in the the New Oxford American Dictionary as described as the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity and vices. Now, think of some of those words. Exaggeration, ridicule, expose, criticize, stupidity, vices. These are all the words that would be poisonous to powerful people, particularly given to the population, the general folks who have a chance to have a go at them. So the idea of satire being infused in a funny drawing is a very powerful thing. And for me, I like to distill actually satire to describe it as, for cartoonists, funny pictures with a point. So essentially, that's what a political cartoon is, employing satire. Now, powerful people do not want to be ridiculed, but there's a specific kind of ridicule that is indigenous to cartoons that I think makes them ultimately the most powerful of this kind of form, and that is caricature. So I'm going to show you 8 pictures here in a row, 8 caricatures, and I want you guys, as I'm talking, to try to figure out the link between each of these drawings, okay? So I wanted to mention about Freedom House, which is an advocacy group with specific interest in democracy, political freedom, human rights. And they did a report recently that suggested that only 14% of the world's population live in a place where there's freedom of the press. And that probably also crosses over exactly to the amount of places in the world where cartoonists can draw their own head of state. So you might have already picked up in the notion of what we're seeing here is that we have here a list of eight presidents of the United States. These are all presidents who I've drawn and cartooned during my career. And one of the other things that they all have in common is that I can do these cartoons and not worry about being arrested by the government. And around the world, cartoonists fear that. I had a situation in 1999 where I was at a gathering of cartoonists from across the Arab world. And I had lunch with a group of them one time, and I said, hey guys, can you tell me how many people here, hands up, who can draw your own head of state? And most of them were shuffling their feet and, stirring their coffee. And one guy put his hand up. He was from Egypt, Goma, and he says to me, I can draw Hosni Mubarak whenever I want to, as long as I do it in a positive light. And that is kind of the way it is for a cartoonist, is that you're very restricted. In fact, there's another anecdote which I'm going to share that took place evidently during the Cold War, when an American cartoonist and a Russian cartoonist were discussing their comparative cartooning worlds. And the American guy said, hey, here in America, I can draw my president in a compromising position whenever I want. And the Russian cartoonist says, well, here in Russia, it's the exact same thing. We can draw your president in a compromising situation anytime we want. So the idea is that caricature is a powerful tool. There is a great description of what caricature is by Annibale Carracci, who was an Italian Renaissance painter, said that a good caricature is more true to life than reality itself. And good caricatures you've seen get to the spirit, to the soul of someone. And you can also understand, imagine here in this room, as I look around, I see some very good faces, that if I had an opportunity to sketch you and do my absolute worst with your face, then that picture appeared in a newspaper, on television, so that 3, 4, 5 million people would ogle and giggle at your worst features. And understand that if you had the hands on the levers of power with the ability to stop that, you would do it, right? Anyone would be inclined to do it because your face is your most vital, closest to your own personality, your ego, and it's a part of your brand when you're standing in front of millions and millions of people. So if you have an individual has the potential to take your face apart and reassemble it under their control, they have a great power. And going back to my time in the classroom with music class, you understood that the hoi polloi, all those around you can love it, but the people at the top have quite a different view altogether. So altogether, I'm looking at 4 different things to remember about cartoons. Number 1, they are pictures. Number 2, they have humor, and so they're funny pictures. They're also funny pictures with a point. And then they're also funny pictures in the point that point their finger at somebody's face. So those are the main reasons why cartoonists are so powerful. But I also want to point out that Victor Novaski, the former editor and publisher of The Nation, wrote a book on this very subject of why are cartoons so powerful, because he found that all of his years, nothing upset readers or even his staff more than cartoons that they had in their publication. So one of the things that he said, which was quite curious, was that he found that cartoons might be powerful because those who are at the sharp end of the pen and their acolytes feel they don't know how to respond in kind to the cartoon. Because the only way, if you use words, we've already said words are less efficient than pictures and cartoons. The only way to appropriately respond to a cartoon is draw another cartoon back, and not many people can do that. So with that, I want to mention that people here are free to draw me as much as they want, and I'll be happy to take that. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I'm just going to save you one more cartoon here. This is for Cartoonist Rights Network for all the great work to do. They've been saving cartoonists around the globe for a few decades here now. And under Terry's leadership, we've got some great things happening, and I'm very excited to be here. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Cal. First of all, I'd like to say an enormous thanks to Rosalind, Terry, Sarah, and the Library of Congress for offering me the opportunity to speak here today. I'm especially honored to be here as a young cartoonist with decades less experience than Cal and Terry in this field, so I hope that I can use my youth and inexperience to provide a unique angle to my remark. Okay, so today I'm excited to share a brief presentation with you that I'm calling Victim and Vice, Political Cartooning's Relationship to Oversimplification. Cartoonists across the political spectrum, but frankly mostly conservatives, frequently oversimplify complicated issues into a few symbols or talking points. While these are often helpful to convey a point of principle quickly and poignantly, as Cal has described, this medium can frequently be abused to drastically overcondense an issue. I'm lucky to have had experience creating cartoons for the Lincoln Project from June 2020 through June 2021 through the presidential election, and for, as Rosalind said, the environmental newsletter Our Daily Planet, which would then merge with John Kerry's organization, where I created cartoons until May last year. So I focused primarily on domestic politics, but that's given me a unique view into the threats facing cartoonists within the United States. So I'd like to interpret the word threats in a way that's a little bit more English majory and conceptual. I believe that one of these key threats to cartoonists' livelihoods, in the United States at least, is one that cartoonists themselves can help eliminate. Cartoonists can help themselves appear more credible and even help save their profession by putting more nuanced arguments on paper. As I'll explain, a reputation for sensationalization and oversimplification can prevent this wonderful medium and the artists and journalists who work in it from being taken seriously. This can and arguably is helping lead to the fall of the medium from publication here in the United States. So my experience working for the center/center-right Lincoln Project and the center-left World War Zero has enabled me to have a better view into where divisiveness can come from. As I especially learned while understanding what talking points had persuaded Trump supporters and were actively persuading future Trump supporters, oversimplification is frequently key to an emotional appeal. Who's the bad guy? Who can we point to and be angry at? Appealing to Trump voters who had been swayed by emotional populist appeals with emotion right back is an appealing and often effective strategy that the Lincoln Project made it their mission to use. Some cartoons do more oversimplifying than others. On the screen here are a few examples of drastically oversimplified cartoons that don't acknowledge the full truth of the situation they're critiquing. And by calling out oversimplification as a key issue here in cartooning, I am not suggesting that a political cartoon needs to put forth a cohesive comparison of two sides of an issue. You don't need a thesis. I am instead suggesting that each political cartoonist needs to take caution to be clear about a few key things. So first, a cartoon needs to be clear about who it's criticizing. So look here on the upper right. Media is not a helpful label. Who in the media are we talking about? Conservative networks? Liberal networks? Even writing the whole media, I'm specifically referring to all you people, is more useful than media. Second, cartoonists need to make accusations that are actually factually grounded. For this example, I refer you to the cartoon on the upper left. There's a fine line, I think, between a satirical exaggeration and a suggestion that something may possibly be happening or will maybe happen. And also, a cartoonist who frequently makes bad faith arguments can also make that line even finer for themselves. Third, related to the factual accusations issue, is the problem of the slippery slope fallacy, which is quite literally in play here in this Ben Garrison cartoon about Fauci as a sink. Shut up and obey, written at the bottom of the cartoon, implies that not only is more coming down the pike for Americans to deal with during COVID, but to boot, Americans will be forced against their will to comply as they slip down a drain of logical fallacies. And fourth, and we can end this slide on a nice simple one, there's what I call the big word fallacy. Many times these big words are not actually big or long words at all, but they're simply words that have big meanings for people, a whole bunch of different meanings. What is justice? What about the Constitution is in play here? What about the Constitution is this cartoonist seeing as crucial? And for us, the viewers, to think about, what is this cartoonist leaving out about his understanding of the Constitution? And of course, I would be remiss not to mention that big words are often used in place of other meanings, especially racist or even fascist implications. This cartoon shows Trump using justice, but what would he really be using to beat up Adam Schiff and those trying to hold him accountable? I'd say a trumping of the rule of law. So this example and all these examples have to do with oversimplification. They take crucial nuance and complexity out of complex issues that would have otherwise helped enrich conversation. If one of these cartoonists had included more clarification about the issues they're discussing, the resulting cartoon would have provided more truth about the issue itself. Perhaps it would actually have stimulated some productive conversation about the topic at hand. If Ben Garrison, for example, while creating that Fauci cartoon, had realized he were making a slippery slope fallacy and had stopped to correct himself and maybe do some research, maybe he would have created a cartoon more in tune with reality and would have actually initiated a different discussion and not gotten kicked off Twitter. So oversimplification of big groups of other people's points of view is a frequent problem with political cartooning. We saw versions of it in the Fauci cartoon with Uncle Sam, who's traditionally represented America, being harmed by Fauci. But this cartoon on the upper, I think I wrote right, but I can't sometimes tell my right from my left, so that's my left, shows all people on the left and right having the same opinion about immigration. I don't think it's factually true that both the entire left and right disliked Trump's wall. Perhaps more specific groups, liberal immigration advocates and xenophobes, would have been more factually accurate. I will stop to point out, of course, that a cartoon, again, should not be a political treatise. It certainly does not need excessive labels, see Ben Garrison again, of every part of it that make perfectly clear its main points. But what if a written editorial article that said the left or the right believed X or Y were all generally of the same point of view? That would be a problem. So why are we not applying the same journalistic standards to our editorial cartoons? Especially if we believe that more people are likely to retain stuff that they see in a cartoon. So I have a few examples of cartoons here showing how to approach an issue using satire without oversimplifying it. They attack common arguments without suggesting by any means that those are the only arguments held by that particular side. They also don't suggest that the exaggeration made of conservatives represents the view of all conservatives. The unique look of the conservative character in this Matt Boers cartoon represents a particular sect of alt-right conservatives. This Jen Sorensen cartoon does the same thing. It portrays and mocks common arguments. It's not saying everyone on this side of the political spectrum believes this. It's not saying that even this particular view also means this, this, and this. It's pointing out common arguments that are made, and I think it's especially productive for that reason. And I think Jen Sorensen's and Matt Boers' resumes reflect that degree of journalistic excellence. So as this cartoon suggests, putting common arguments up against depictions of a harsh, seemingly exaggerated but not exaggerated reality is a way to use exaggeration in a cartoon without misrepresenting a group's arguments. Putting exaggerated arguments up against common sense or a normal reality believed in by real Americans is an easy way to misrepresent something. This nuance, I have found, is actually most frequently achieved when a cartoon is made up of multiple panels rather than just one. But of course, one-panel cartoons are more than capable of achieving sufficient complexity. I believe that regardless of how satirical a piece of media is supposed to be, the claims it makes must be factual. Any exaggeration cannot wage factually incorrect accusations at a group. This is misinformation. Simply, satirists need to do better to ensure that their satire is coming across as such and not simply a representation of what is actually happening or what they guess is actually happening. And how do you achieve that? Partially by stepping out of your echo chamber, but that's another presentation. Just because certain arguments from various sides of the political spectrum get the most media attention does not mean they are actually the most common arguments. Cartoonists would be wise to spend time actually analyzing and attacking more common arguments held by people not on either extreme. This field is under threat by both external threats, foreign and domestic, and also those working within the field itself. There are particular tools that cartoonists can use to make their own work more persuasive. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me here. I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to talk about the law, so I'm going to put everybody to sleep. But hopefully I can keep it as lively as the past speakers have done. I wanted to circle back to Terry's keynote because there's a theme there that you see that is one of the most dangerous things, I think, for press freedom that we encounter a lot, and that's when governments and public officials of all types use laws that are meant for one thing to try and criminalize journalistic activity. And the classic example of that is probably espionage. One, we've recently seen the detention of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich in Russia on espionage charges. He's just the most recent example of that. There have been many others, including in countries like Iran and Myanmar, going back decades. And it's not limited to espionage. We've also seen the Maria Ressa and Rappler case in the Philippines is also a key example of that, where laws like tax evasion and cyber libel are being used to try and intimidate journalists who are perceived as critical of the government or public officials. And that theme it goes throughout all of the examples that Terry noted. In particular, you saw the use of defamation. You've seen the use of computer crime laws generally. You see money laundering and other financial crimes being deployed against journalists. You've seen material support for terrorism and many other similar laws. Why do governments do that? In a lot of ways, I think it's tough to say the quiet part out loud, and so you want to offer a sheen or a veneer of legitimacy to trying to target journalistic activity, but it's really a pernicious phenomenon globally. And it's also one that you can see in the United States. And why is that relevant? Well, the United States is a bellwether for many of these things. And if the United States gets it right and the First Amendment works properly, then countries around the world can be chastened. Autocratic countries around the world can be chastened. And if the U.S. gets it wrong, then it empowers autocrats around the world to try and push the envelope. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on how these things operate in the United States. And I do think that there's reason for cautious optimism, and I'll give you my reasons why that's the case. But I can give one example of, in the United States, of this happening. I'm not a political cartoonist, but you can imagine a similar thing happening with any journalist and with any journalist who also works in the opinion journalism space. In Missouri, there was a journalist with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who realized that a state-run website was misconfigured in a way that if you simply pulled up the HTML code for the website, it was disclosing the social security number of teachers publicly. And that reporter disclosed that fact to the Missouri state government responsibly, waited to publish until they'd fixed that misconfiguration of the website. And instead of thanking that reporter for doing their job, the governor threatened the reporter with investigation and prosecution for hacking. And I'm not a computer person, but even I can tell you that something like that is not hacking. It's not an improper intrusion into a computer network. But the fact that the law on the books was vague enough to allow the governor to go after the journalists in that way is what we're talking about here. I'll give you two other examples in the United States where, and this is where I think there's some reason for, as I say, cautious optimism. On the national security front, which we at the Reporters Committee work on a fair bit, one of the areas of concern is using federal laws that govern espionage and national security information in a way that gets to journalistic activity. And so over the last 15 years, you've seen the prosecution of journalistic sources for what are colloquially known as national security leaks in numbers that far exceed what has ever happened historically. There are a lot of different reasons for that, but there is a consequence for that kind of aggressive investigation and prosecution of leaks to the media, and that is simply that sources won't come forward and the free flow of information is diminished. In 2021, that trend hopefully culminated, we'll see, in revelations that the Trump administration in the last year, in 2020, had authorized secret court orders and subpoenas for the telephone and email records of 8 journalists across 3 outlets, CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And again, the term secret lead is doing a lot of work there. Normally, you have to notify news organizations when you do that. The Trump administration did not, meaning that, at least with respect to the phone records, they had been turned over, and so the bell had rung. There's very little that you can do in that situation. That caused considerable outcry. And in 2021, the Justice Department, under Attorney General Merrick Garland, announced that it would revise its policy to make it more difficult for the department to do that, to try and snoop into reporters' records. And that policy, from what we've seen, appears to be working. We haven't seen similar cases since. And so, again, that's kind of a reason for cautious optimism, but it's something that we monitor pretty closely. And I'll give you one other example, which is defamation law. I think in the United States, the Supreme Court, in a civil rights era case called New York Times v. Sullivan, effectively said that for a public official, that under the First Amendment, for a public official to sue someone who they perceive as critical, they have to prove that that speaker really harbored doubts that what they were saying was true. That rule, the actual malice rule, which is a terrible misnomer, and try not to use the term actual malice, but that rule has been a crucial protection for public interest journalism going on more than half a century at this point. I'm sure you've seen there's been some agitation in certain quarters to revisit the actual malice rule, particularly in the light of the advent of the information age. In Florida, there was a law that was proposed and supported by the governor that would have teed up court challenges to that actual malice standard, as well as other precedent that follows on. Following conservative opposition to that law, it died on the vine. It didn't go anywhere this legislative session in Florida. So again, room for cautious optimism. And why? Because I still think that there is a sense in this country that strong free expression protections protect everybody, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum. So there are other examples of this, of kind of what I'm talking about, the use of laws that are meant to cover one thing and then are used creatively to go after journalistic activity. But I just want to end on what can you do? What are some of the solutions to what are some of the solutions that would help to bolster press freedom protections and protections for opinion journalists and political cartoonists here in the United States, and thus serve as a signal to the rest of the country? The first thing, we're doing it right now. It's education. It's folks getting together, paying attention, realizing what the issues are, and then also for advocates educating themselves, learning what are the financial crimes that you could see coming down the road. How do we deal with computer crime being applied to journalists? And I think all of those things are crucial to keeping things on the right track. And then there are concrete solutions. There are numerous organizations that work in this space. The Reporters Committee is one. We work closely with the Committee to Protect Journalists, Article 19, Reporters Without Borders, many others. And they all, and one thing that we've all been doing is the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which you can find online, that tracks press freedom violations in the U.S. in a systematic way, something that hasn't really been done before. And then there's also specific pieces of advocacy that you can do. In the U.S., there was a push last year to pass a federal SHIELD law. SHIELD legislation prevents journalists from having to disclose their confidential sources or other sensitive material in courts. That law didn't pass, but it's gotten closer than it ever has historically. And so we hope to re-up those efforts again this year. And there are other laws like that, anti-SLAPP laws in the states that counter lawsuits that are meant to intimidate people into silence as opposed to actually recover for damages. Those are also key things. And then I think ultimately, as I say, the key thing is to be aware. Complacency is where we lose this particular fight. And again, thank you for having me here, and please to spread the word.
Our audience has been very, very gracious and patient, and we want to give you a chance to ask questions, and then we'll have some questions among us. There are microphones on both sides of the aisles, so if you have a question, if you'd please queue up, and we will get to you. Please.
Hi, my name's Jacob. I run a comic book store here in DC. We've got a thriving community of aspiring up-and-coming artists, but I feel like I think a lot of them feel very disengaged from political cartooning for a lot of reasons. For, you know, traditional media losing money, the Nib shutting down. The Nib is a huge community resource, and when artists think that they could, you know, they could draw political cartoons and, you know, get kicked off of Twitter or threatened by their government, or they could just draw something else. Like, what can we do to kind of inspire the next generation of political cartoonists?
You just spoiled a question I was going to ask Alex, so thanks for that. It gives me less to do. From my perspective, I have to be crystal clear. Our organisation is not about what you would call creative or professional rights. So we're not a trade association or a union or anything like that. So our specific mission is human rights based. And although I have concerns for sure and worries about what the future of the profession is, especially in the context of what you're talking about, the shift away from traditional media, the threat that AI presents to creatives of all kinds, and that sense of disengagement that you're talking about, which I definitely agree with, and I think Alex is the exception rather than the rule. I think most politically astute or politically engaged young people who want to draw are at the very least doing the sort of multi-panel cartoons that Alex mentioned in our presentation, if not something, you know, much longer form, a comic book, a graphic novel, what have you. So I think political cartooning is always going to exist. And in actual fact, many of the people we have assisted in recent years haven't necessarily been people making a living from it, but it's what they do to further the causes that they care about. So it sounds a strange thing to say. In an ideal world, we would have no clients, but I think we always will, because I think there will always be people making political cartoons. The question is, and it's an open question, is whether they will actually sustain themselves and make a living from it. Those are two, you know, completely different things. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's I have a friend who runs comedy stuff at the Kennedy Center, and they emailed me the other day and went, "Is any comic in store in DC teaching political cartooning classes?" So they haven't announced anything yet, but I think that big organizations that already have a reach in the arts can think maybe outside the box of performing arts or comics that are purely for entertainment and think about how they can be used as sources of information. So I like to think of those kinds of things as like broccoli brownies, where you give someone a brownie and it's secretly giving them vitamins and minerals at the same time. So I think taking advantage of big resources that already have access to people eliminates the half of the battle of having to reach out to those people at all. So, but yeah.
We have a question over here.
Yes, hi. So I'm a fan of history, and so this is a two-pointer, I guess. First, whenever I find myself reading about presidents, even as far back as Lincoln, I always see these cartoons depicting him as a coward going into D.C. in disguise, you know, after being elected because of assassination threats. So the first one is, when did it start? How early did we see actual cartoons being a popular thing? Just because I haven't found anything about Washington or even Adams. I know that they had a very contested election in 1800, but I can't find anything like that early on. So that's the first question. The second one would be, how do you find today's reality with visual arts being so, you know, quantity-wise, just being so spread out? Is it easier today to just have memes or things like that? So how do you see that as a good thing for arts, you know, being so available to everyone? Do you see that as a good thing for cartoons that are so complex like this, or do you see that as a you know, hindrance and maybe a threat to the existence of art like this?
Clay has a lot to say about memes versus political cartoons.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You stare at the question you give
Yeah, I got
I'll come to that too, but go ahead. I'm no historian, and so I don't have a specific answer to your first part of your question. However, we all know whenever printed presses were available and there was an opportunity, all the printers would try to get pictures in their publications in order to gain readership, but also because they're so powerful and so interesting. So much so that imagine in the 1800s and 1700s, before photographs were available, is that the way that most of the population who cast their votes were casting their votes on caricatures of individuals they saw rather than on photographs. So you can imagine the kind of power that those publications had. Harper's Weekly is a very famous one that you know about from when Lincoln was around and so on. And the way that they captured the nation's imagination, and cartoons are probably at the zenith at that point in their power. But prior to that, I can't tell you exactly if Washington was captured in a picture, but you can be pretty sure that he has, and it was likely it was going to be in an exaggerated form of one way or another, because any opportunity to do something exaggeration, any kid in a classroom is going to draw their teacher or their friends. Because given an opportunity with a pen and a line, people are going to have some fun with it, I think.
Caricature itself goes back to the Renaissance. Caricatura is derived from caricare, which is to charge, to fill something up the way you would charge a glass. So it's a portrait with, literally a portrait plus. It's a picture of someone but with more. And because the artists of the Renaissance, so many of them were, natural philosophers, they had analytical minds, what we would call scientists today, as well as artists. The point of the exercise was actually to be analytical and to determine where is the line between the beautiful and the grotesque. So they would take observed life, likenesses of real people, and then in a playful way distort them, exaggerate them. And they were actually, for a time, fashionable gifts. It was what the Medicis of the world were giving to each other as kind of private jokes to begin with, before, as Cal mentions, before the press came in and kind of made it more of a populist art form. And then even before newspapers, you had stories of print houses, the windows of print shops, essentially being the very earliest kind of social media pages where people would come and take a look at political cartoons and caricatures of people in shop windows. As far as the second part of your question goes, I agree with Cal. I think visual thinking, visual communication is a skill. I think it's a valuable skill, as I think it's applicable in all sorts of fields. Cartoonists have an ability to work, and certainly in my own kind of professional life, I've worked in a variety of different theatres, if you like, public sector, private sector, where people wanted to capture information and communicate it, sometimes very serious, quite crucial information, and communicate it using the cartoon medium. I used to say before the AI came in that editors think cartoonists are dispensable, but if the job title was mimetic content generator specialist, they wouldn't get rid of us that easily, because they would all, but you've got to have a mimetic content generator specialist on the staff. That's indispensable, So, like I said, there's two columns. There's whether the cartoons are powerful, a valid means of communication. All those things are yes. And then there's another column over here where, is someone going to pay you for them? Are you going to be able to do it as a job? Is it going to proliferate to the point where, in essence, everybody and anybody is capable at short notice of generating something that looks like or has the appearance of a cartoon? And then we're in that kind of situation, is it a job anymore, or is it just something that kind of belongs to the wider world, and it ceases to be as kind of niche or specialist as it has been in the past?
So I have a question for Cal. Have any politicians you depicted complained to you?
About cartoon, well, you get that's curious. So first of all, most of the cartoonists who are professionals, and I'm just going to break for a second because I was so happy to hear that there's so many aspiring cartoonists who want to use their skills to express themselves and also help and further the discussion in the world. For those of us who have been lucky enough to have been paid to do it, what happens is you often get reactions from politicians, and sometimes they want the originals. And some, well-known, I remember when Steve Forbes ran for president, when he dropped out of the race, he contacted every cartoonist around the country and wanted to have every single original about him, no matter how wicked it was. And then there's politicians who hate everything you could possibly do of them. And I had a governor of the state of Maryland who had took particular umbrage to my cartoons. And one time there was a project in the city of Baltimore where they commissioned 18 artists to create individual miniature golf holes that they were going to be used as a charitable event. And I did one of the governor. I did a large caricature of him, of which there would be a hole in the middle of his head. It was called the fill the pothole hole. And then on the opening day, the governor was there. And so he came and was playing on the hole and was irate by the whole thing. And while the cameras were rolling, he said to me, Cal, one day I'm going to make a golf hole out of you, but I'm not going to do it of your face. I'll do it of another part of your anatomy. So it shows this idea that his reaction was to try to do a cartoon back at me, which I thought was very clever. But politicians pay attention to the cartoons because of the fact that their faces appear in the cartoons.
I have a very favorite story to share about what I call the guilty pleasure of public officials collecting cartoons of them, no matter how grotesque. We mentioned earlier this seminal case between Jerry Falwell and Larry Flint of Hustler magazine back in the late 1980s. Over the years since that wonderful opportunity I had to represent the Cartoonists organization as Friends of the Court, I've dug into archives and tried to find material about the case and how it was that this conservative court led by Chief Justice Rehnquist came to unanimously reverse the jury verdict in favor of Reverend Falwell. And I've given various presentations on the case over these last 35 years. Well, about 15 years ago, I was getting ready for a presentation. I wanted to refresh my act. So I happened to be at a barrister's dinner where Justice Scalia was present and often came to this dinner. So I sidled up to him and introduced myself. Of course, he was on the court when the Hustler case was decided and was one of the most animated and entertaining justices during the oral argument. He had the entire courtroom in stitches. If you haven't heard the oral argument, you can find it online. It's extremely entertaining. So I asked if I could interview him and about the case, and it's rare that justices will agree to that because they may have upcoming cases involving First Amendment issues. But he said, call my office. I did. He said, come on down to my chambers. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. It turns out he wasn't available in person, but would agree to talk to me by phone. And in the course of the conversation, of course, he acknowledged he has a man cave. And what's in the man cave? Original cartoons by Patrick Oliphant, you know? And Oliphant drew some really grotesque caricatures of Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justice Scalia. And over time, at the time, I didn't know what the cartoon was, in particular the originals that he had, but after he passed, I was able to reach his wife, Maureen Scalia, who kindly reached out to her children who had taken over these cartoons in his collection, and we were able to identify the original cartoons he had. But he was so important to that decision, and fortunately, he and Chief Justice Rehnquist were great students of American history. And to answer the other question over here, during the oral argument, Justice Scalia made reference to the fact that George Washington was depicted as an ass and other cruel beasts during his presidency.
Clay, you
Alex?
wanna jump in?
Oh,
How's it going? Can you hear me? All right. It's been a while since I've been on stage. Yeah, my question is about social media. I'm Clay Jones. I'm a political cartoonist. Nobody knows me. I'm not famous. So the question is, I jokingly claim that that I am the most persecuted cartoonist from social media, mostly because having cartoons removed on Instagram. I lost my Instagram account and had to rebuild it. Even whenever they said, "Whoops, we made a mistake. We're gonna reinstate it," then they never did. I've been suspended on Facebook multiple times for like 30 days. And I had to stop I gave up on LinkedIn because they just kept taking everything down. The only one that hasn't really hit me, I've been hit by YouTube, I've been hit by TikTok. The only one that hasn't really hit me, honestly, surprisingly, is Twitter. But everybody else has hit me. So my question is, I know they have algorithms, but they're always challenged, and I assume at some point a human being looks at this and they uphold it. And yes, social media outlets are very inconsistent with their own rules. So my question that you're not going to be able to answer, because I can't answer, is how do we educate social media on the difference between libel, defamation, and satire, which is what we do mostly, and also the fact that we are journalists. This is it's a First Amendment right, and I know that they have the First Amendment right to not allow our stuff on their privately owned platforms, whatever, but they need to understand what satire is, obviously. Good luck getting a noose or a Klan robe and a cartoon on Facebook. So,
Yeah.
Gabe, do you have a thought about this, putting on your advocacy hat?
Me? No. It's hard. It's extremely. This is some of the most difficult stuff out there, precisely because, as you noted, as a legal matter, the First Amendment protects the moderation decisions by the platforms. I would say one thing, and I can't speak to whether moderation decisions are correct or not. In a lot of cases, you're talking about billions of different instances of speech, and it's a moderation on a good day is extremely challenging. But one thing I will say from the perspective of how to potentially make it better is the incentives that are placed on the platforms, and the incentives that are placed on the platforms derive out of what are the applicable laws, right? That the platforms are trying to calibrate how they comply, their compliance sort of strategy with those laws. And so one thing I would say is that there's a push in states like Texas and Florida that passed laws that would give the state authorities the ability to police what they perceive as bias in terms of platforms' moderation choices. So, and these laws were introduced and passed in the wake of President Trump being removed from Twitter, from being either suspended or banned from the platforms. And then you've also got laws that are being proposed and or passed in states like Washington State and New York that would incentivize greater moderation on the part of the platforms in a way that violates the First Amendment, or at least we would argue violates the First Amendment in a similar way. In other words, the states are trying to determine the states are trying to tell the platforms either moderate less or moderate more, but based on the content that is being moderated. And if the First Amendment stands for anything, it's that the state doesn't have the power, shouldn't have the power to regulate speech based on its content, based on what's being said, unless it has a really, really, really good reason. But that's also super complicated. So, yeah, it's a really unsatisfactory answer. I totally get that.
totally.
I'm sorry.
Let me point out that 99% of the time that my cartoons have been removed from social media is because I'm criticizing hate groups. Right. Republicans. So that's pretty much all it is. And I don't think there's anything legal that you can do about it. I'm just mostly talking about, and I wouldn't want anything legal to tell somebody what they can and can't do on their platforms, because I'm not a Republican. What I'm just saying is, how do we educate them? And honestly, I don't think we can, because that'd be like trying to educate a Republican.
Well, and one I remember one cartoon that got a lot of attention, I think, from Facebook was where you had the old Taliban, and you had like a Taliban guy beating someone, and then the new Taliban, and then he just had like a smiley face on instead, like a smiley face emoji while still beating somebody. And it makes me just, like, it's so obvious. Like, it's kind of like the Antelnes thing. I'm like, is there any media literacy here? So I'm wondering if I wonder if the content moderators are just not paying it close enough attention. Like, I wonder if they just need to hire more content moderators.
Punch the box, like when it comes before 'em,
Yeah, there's like,
whatever,
look,
I'm
there,
gonna hold that, and
yeah,
actually
there's a
look at it.
Taliban guy here, there's a KKK guy here, like, bad. Like, I wonder if they're just not
Yeah.
paying attention. So I wonder if just hiring more moderators would be good, and maybe, yeah, hire more
I
moderators.
know some things about review, and they're saying, well, we're overrun right now, we don't have enough moderators. And
Yeah.
I have seen that a few times.
Mhm.
And I've even had like Facebook tell me that they are suppressing my views from being seen. I mean, not my posts from being seen and stuff. And when they say that, and there's so many days that they're giving you that, and then whenever that's lifted, and you notice it from your shares, like, it used to be like impossible for me to do a cartoon that didn't get at least 100 shares. And now it's like I'm lucky if I get 20 to 25. But the other part of that is that they are suppressing you not because of your views, but because they want you to buy the boosting thing.
Well, maybe they just are reluctant to have a platform used to discuss serious issues. Like, they don't want images of the KKK showing up on people's feeds because that might push them off the platform.
So they're like newspaper editors.
Maybe.
So we have a question over here.
Hello. This is also a social media question, but a little bit more about, how news spreads. So I was wondering about maybe the volume of lawsuits or the volume of people that Cartoonist Rights has had to protect as social media has become more prevalent. Like, what has that done to cartooning? Because obviously it's spread, the ability for our cartoonists to work in a way that is more global, but I'm sure it's also changed how much attention each of those cartoons has gotten.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's been transformative on both sides of the coin. It's enabled cartoonists to build audiences. Again, cartoonists who, like I mentioned, maybe don't necessarily have a professional gig, but they can still use the social media platforms to build a following, and then they can then leverage that following into ways of getting a return. Maybe they are able to sell a book or hold an exhibition on the strength of the following that they've gathered over social media in the intervening time. But it's also obviously a vector by which threat can come to those people. As Abacor was outlining earlier on, certainly online threats are what he and his family have had to experience in recent years. We have multiple cartoonists who describe the same sort of experiences, that it's and would go farther and say that it's not organic, that it's often organised, that it may in part be driven by bots, that it may in part be driven by other forms of algorithm or even AI mechanisms, and alluding to what Clay was talking about, depending on what part of the world you're talking about, social media is the internet. They don't have anything else. So there are certain parts of Asia, certain parts of Africa where the overwhelming majority of interactions online are on Facebook. So if Facebook decide that you're not going to get to use the platform or that you're not welcome, you're essentially denied the internet. And I think there's an increasing argument towards that being a human right, that you don't get to be a 21st century citizen if you're not getting internet access. So the freedom of these, as Clay points out, privately owned platforms, and we all sign the same terms and conditions, and we essentially sign away a lot of things that might be described as privileges when we do so. But equally, in some parts of the world, the responsibility that they carry is enormous, and it's concerning when the owner of a platform decides to acquiesce to the demands of a particular regime, as we have seen happen. An example I would give, it's not one of the more up-to-date platforms, but WordPress, for example, were notorious for this, where a particular government would say, because of a blog we don't like, that blog goes, or nobody in the country gets to see anything on WordPress, and WordPress would invariably jump to. The example we highlighted a few years ago was Carlos Latouf Brazilian cartoonist, but very critical of Erdogan in Turkey, and they wanted his blog to be denied access to people in Turkey. So it's something that we are constantly engaging with, and particularly the activist cartoonists that I've described, social media is essential for them.
Abacor?
Yeah, sure.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Bueno, yo creo que es importante el querer saber momentos especiales. En mi vida yo he tenido dos que puedo remarcar. También este es muy importante en mi vida.
So he says, of course, you know, as cartoonists, there are very special moments in our lives, and I like to share two of them. One of them is actually being here with you today.
Déjenme contarles que una vez expuse en La Paz mis caricaturas después de, creo, 18 años de no hacerlo nunca. Lo expuse a la gente y creo que esos dos momentos en esa exposición marcaron algo que para mí fue impresionante, que me dijo realmente que estoy haciendo cosas buenas.
Okay. So he remembers the time when he had an exhibit of his cartoons in La Paz in Bolivia after more than 18 years of not, doing any exhibits like that. ¿Qué pasó en esa exposición?
Lo que pasó es que vino una pareja, un matrimonio de un área rural, de un pueblito,
Okay. So he remembers that at that exhibit, there was a couple from a very rural town in Bolivia, a couple that came up to the event.
Ellos venían justamente porque compraban el periódico donde están mis caricaturas y lo enseñaban en clases y veían y les explicaban por qué la caricatura es tan importante y en el sentido porque esta es la verdadera historia que muestra el país. A los estudiantes, a los niños les mostraba mis caricaturas y ellos querían conocerme a mí.
Okay, so he's saying that this couple used, they would use the newspapers, the local newspapers, as it's a teaching tool because the newspaper published his cartoons. And this couple was using the newspapers to show the students the history of the country. So because he believes that cartoons also are a tool to understanding history.
Eso fue lindo por el sentido de que utilizan mis caricaturas para contar una historia, la historia de Bolivia, y ellos lo empleaban.
So he's saying this was beautiful for him because it showed that they were using his cartoons to teach students, little kids, the history of Bolivia.
Después vino una viejita, más o menos casi de 90 años, apenas podía caminar, y vino con un álbum en la mano donde tenía todos los recortes desde que creo que comencé.
And another beautiful moment he experienced at that exhibit is a 90-year-old woman, a very frail woman who could hardly even walk, showed up with an album full of all the clippings of all the newspapers that published his cartoons.
Ella quería conocerme, quería saber quién era el que hacía los dibujos.
So she wanted to know who was this guy responsible for these cartoons. She wanted to meet him.
Fue interesante, casi hasta las lágrimas, la abracé ella también. Y bueno, la pasamos lindo ya con los profesores discutiendo. Dije que voy a ir a su pueblito para presentarme y bueno, es algo que tengo que hacer.
Okay, so he's saying that it was a very emotional moment. They hugged each other. He was on the verge of tears because it was such a moving moment to see the impact of his work. So he pledged to one day go back to that little town and talk to the professors, the teachers and the students.
Por eso habrá de sacar el libro para la señora y para todos, pero yo creo que esos momentos son importantes porque dice, estás haciendo algo bien, se está transmitiendo esto.
So those moments are very special because you connect with people and you convey the importance, the significance of cartoons.
Yo quiero saber de Carl, de Terry o de quien sea, cuál es ese momento especial que les ha marcado también la vida en estas circunstancias.
So his question for either Cal or Terry or anyone else on the panel, can you describe that special moment that came in your work, the special moment that you had in your career?
Thank you.
Thank you, gracias.
First of all, thank you for that question. Thank you for being here. And as you were saying that special moment, particularly about the personal, interpersonal connection that you found that your cartoons had connected with individuals or groups. When you sit in your room by yourself drawing this, you're trying to communicate with the world, but you have no idea if you're connecting. And when you have those moments, they're incredibly special. And my story is very similar to yours because it has to do with kids in classrooms. I had been asked by a school teacher outside Baltimore to come and address her class of 12-year-olds. And I have spoken to many schools before, but in this case, she said she prepared me before I joined them, saying, look, I just have to tell you, these kids have been reading your cartoons every day ever since the school year started 6 months ago, every single day. They cut out the new cartoons from the newspaper, they discuss it with their parents over breakfast, and then they come in and they talk about the cartoons. She uses the cartoons as vocabulary lessons to teach them about important words. She uses them as discuss the visual metaphors about how that's used in language as a form of communication. She would also take the cartoons and then cut them out and put them in a week's package that she would then hang on the wall all the way around the room. And then every Friday she would rearrange them and the kids would have to put them back in order. So when I spoke to these kids, I was astonished at how much they knew about the world, more so than even many of my peers, I'm sure. And it showed you that cartoons have a great power to penetrate and connect with people.
Well, thank you all very much for attending today. I can't imagine a more poignant or appropriate way to end than for Abacor's stories and Cal's own story. So thank you very much. Keep reading about Cartoonist Rights. Thank you.